Hi there. Thanks for joining us. Today we're going to talk about fall vegetable gardening. What are those things that you can do to plant in the fall to have when all of the tomatoes and peppers are sort of at the end of their season and not looking so good? What are the things that you want to have in the garden for the fall and even early winter to get you through the gardening season? Because one thing that gardeners do is actually forget that there are multiple garden seasons. We often go out and buy the tomatoes and peppers early in the spring and plant them in the garden, and then we don't add anything else. And that can actually be a great disservice because one of the most productive times in the garden is in the fall. As those temperatures cool down, things really appreciate that in the garden, and we get a lot of great variety in the fall garden. So this evening, we're going to talk a little bit about what we can plant and how to figure out when to plant it. We're going to talk about that in terms of the frost and freeze dates. And we'll be learning a little bit more about that this evening. So when we talk about the fall crops that we grow, we think about the considerations for those crops. Usually we have the crops that prefer cooler weather, the cold crops like broccoli and cauliflower and cabbage, the leafy greens. A lot of things like that really enjoy the cool weather of fall, and it's a great time to think about planting those in the middle of summer, actually, is when we start planting and planting those things. Just about all the cool season crops are frost tolerant, and frost is, we'll learn a little bit about what frost is, but that's that time whenever the temperatures get down enough, cold enough to give us a little of that frost on the plant, a little ice formation. And some can even tolerate freezing. And some, we'll talk about which ones do that so you can really extend the garden season. We also think about getting some of those fast maturing crops, the warm season crops like beans and cucumbers and squash. You can actually get some of the fast maturing ones to mature fast enough if you plant them in midsummer, like mid-July, in some places, maybe a little earlier or a little later, depending where you are. And so those can go into the fall until there is a frost that will kill them, but you might be able to get a fall crop out of those as well. So the thing to keep in mind as we're planting our fall garden is the frost and freeze dates. So these are determined by NOAA, which is the National Oceanographic and Aeronautical Administration. They take a look at the weather data over the last 3 decades or so, and they compare it. They look at when is the first frost in this year versus next year, and they sort of find an average of those. They actually calculate that, and they offer a prediction. They offer probabilities. It's not perfect, but we can have early frosts that are before the predicted frost date. We can have late frosts. We can have them right on schedule. It really depends on the year and the weather and the climate, and we've seen those change a little bit. And we'll learn a little bit about how those might change in the future. So here are the categories that we're going to talk about that you might see in like a weather forecast, or if you actually look up your frost dates, you might see these. And these are the things to keep in mind whenever you are planning your garden. A light frost is 36 degrees, and we'll learn about in a bit that that can damage some of those warm season crops. It may not kill them, but definitely some damage. Frost and freeze are the 2 big terms that we need to know about. Frost is at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and freeze is at 28 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's what we keep in mind for those cool season crops. And then a hard freeze is under 28, and we have crops that can go down to below that until about the early 20s, so down to about 20 degrees is what we look for on some of the crops. And you might find some of that weather data with predictions of probability on there. And the most common ones you'll see is 10%, 50%, and 90%. 10% means it's very unlikely to happen. And so you might have a very early date for the first frost, and it's not likely to happen. It'll be a 10% chance. And then every day after that, the chance increases. And then we get to the 50%, which is sort of the daily or the average frost date or the median frost date. And this is the one that most people use. It's sort of like when there's a 50-50 chance, and every day afterward, the chances increase. So we want to aim for about that date. And then we get to 90%, and that's when frost or freeze is very likely. And we can use that date if we want to gamble a little bit, but that is, the date that is going to be most likely for you to have a frost or a freeze. It's almost guaranteed that it will have frosted or froze before that date. So which crops are affected at which temperature? So like I said, at 36 degrees, the light frost, the warm season crops can be damaged: tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, squash, all those things. At 32 degrees, all of those will be killed. So most of the annual herbs like basil, beans, corn, cucumbers, eggplant, there's a whole list of them there. It may damage but not kill the frost tolerant or the freeze tolerant plants. So some of the plants that can tolerate a freeze, there might be some light damage at frost. The freeze at 28% will kill some of those more tender or less hardy cold tolerant plants. Beets, carrots, cauliflower, lettuce, onions, peas, spinach, Swiss chard. And it may damage but not kill the hard freeze tolerant plants. And those hard freeze plants are the ones that will last the longest in the garden. They're usually broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, kale, kohlrabi, turnips. Those will last the longest in the garden season. So if you can see there's a map of Nebraska hidden in there, all these little blotches of color. And all of these, this is from, there's a national or a Midwest climate center. And I found this is an interactive map. You put in where you want to look, and it zooms in on the map. So here's the map of Nebraska. So this is the median first date for what they're calling a 32 degrees freeze, which would be frost. So if we look at the colors, the dark green, which is one of the more prevalent colors, the median first frost is, according to this map, October 1st to 10th. Then we have some patches that are a little later, October 11th to 20th. And then the light blue is September 21st to 30th. And then all the way over, if we have our Scotts Bluff people over here in the dark blue, that's September 1st to 10th. However, if you look at the data, I told you it takes 3 decades worth of data, and the figures haven't been figured out yet for the last decade. So this is 2010. I imagine that this will have a pretty significant shift whenever they do the math again, just because our weather has been way different over the last 10 years in terms of the cold dates. And this is the 50% date. So if you want to push it further, you can go to the 10% or the 90% date. So this is just a guideline. Now, if we look at the actual freeze date, which is when most of our cold season crops will be killed, we have the light green, or the lightest green is October 21st to 31st. So these blotches like around Lincoln and this little blotch around southern Nebraska. And then this medium green is October 11th through 20th. So if you're anywhere there, that's when the freeze is, or the expected freeze is. Dark green is October 1st through the 10th. And then all of our friends back over in the West there, it's a little bit earlier. We have September 11th through the 20th and September 21st through the 30th over in far western Nebraska. So in general, and David is going to lead you through a math problem. You didn't know you were going to have to do math tonight, but David's going to lead you through a math problem shortly to actually figure out specifically, looking at a specific crop, when you have to plant it in order to get a harvest. This is a little graphic that I found that has some general dates on it. So it's a guideline, so you can be, oh yeah, it's time to plant this, so I need to plant it right now. So if we look at this little chart, this is for zone 5, so most of Nebraska would be here. The bands that go across, so at the top we have, it talks about planting the green, and then It's still, beans are still, like I said, we can still plant some beans. So it's still orange, which is plant or seed transplant outside. So if we look at July, which we're in July, it's saying that you can still plant beans, you can still plant Brussels sprouts. So that would be, you can still plant broccoli, beets, all those things. So if we look at here, we have those cold season things that we can plant again, starting in July and August. We have cabbage, carrots, cauliflower. I mean, if you had a really fast maturing corn, you could still get it in. That would be a push, I think. But there are some that's like very fast maturing. Cucumbers, kale, lettuce, onions, peas, spinach. So all of those things, some of the squashes like the fast zucchinis, you can still do. So very generally, those are things that you can still do right now, or even coming up into August. You notice that some of this stuff you don't plant until August or September. And that really depends on where you live and the math. And now I'm going to turn it over to David, and he's going to teach you about math.
Okay, well, this is the math part and figuring out that planting date based off of our weather and our data from Nebraska. The university has also kept well over a century worth of weather data that we can draw upon, which is really important. But these are the factors that we need to be looking at when we select a cultivar of vegetables. And let's look at the transplant time based off of that median frost date and go backwards and start counting. So the number of days from seedling or transplant outdoors to the harvest, the number of days from the seed to the transplantable size. So if you're going to start your own transplants, then you need to account for that. And so that's why tomatoes are seeded early in the spring, and we have to count for so many weeks in the greenhouse, and then 2 weeks of hardening them outdoors before we can plant them once we get to a frost-free date. So we have to account for that seedling growth on those crops that you're going to grow as seedlings versus something that's directly planted as a seed in the ground. Looking at the average harvest period, how long do you want to harvest or pick this crop when it's mature and enjoy it on average? We also talk about the fall factor, which means we're starting to slow down. We're starting to get cooler temperatures in the daytime and in the evening, and our heat units are going downhill. So that's slowing that process down, slowing the maturation of the vegetables. So that will be another thing that is important. Also, if your vegetable is frost tender, is really important. So if you're going to do fall beans, for example, fall green beans, then you need to add that factor in because it can be damaged with the frost. So that is something to put into consideration versus a crop like cabbage. We had cabbage growing in the research farm garden at North Platte last year, and it got down to 27 degrees, and it nipped it, kind of damaged it a little, dinged it a little bit, but it came out of it. If we went any colder for a longer sustained period, it probably would have taken it out too. So we add all of these factors, the number of days from seeding to transplant, the number of days from seed to a transplantable size, if you have a crop that you have to do that with, the average period of harvest that you want to be harvesting your vegetables, the fall factor, and then if you need to add another 14 days for the frost tender factor, add those numbers together, and that will give you the number of days that you need to count backwards. So John, I believe you need to, oh, thank you. So I have kind of set up a little bit of a schedule and an example that I use to help keep track, and I've taught my master gardeners. But first I buy a calendar. A lot of times, you know, we get calendars in the mail at work, or you get a calendar at home. So I've got it set to October. So let's look at that. We'll keep this and we will start counting backwards on it. So we're going to count on the day before we have our frost day that we've decided upon. You count the day before as your first day. So in our example that I have on green beans, the day is October 11th, so we're going to count backwards starting on the 10th. So I'm going to take October 10th and I'm going to write a 1 here. And then I'm going to start counting backwards. And I like to use the corner of my calendars. So that gives me an idea. You can even color code your crops based if you have different vegetables going. You know, the bottom corner is cabbage. The upper right-hand corner is green beans. The other corner is carrots. So you can keep track of those using, you know, your corners or symbols or color coding is really handy. So we look at the frost date map, which we'll show you in a little bit. We will show you the frost tender crop list. That is really important to know. John talked about that already. Which ones are going to survive some cold, so what's going to get hit at 32 degrees, what's going to survive something that's going to go under 30 into the 20s. And then research your crops and research your varieties ahead of time. Maybe we don't have a lot of time, but you can select a cultivar that's going to mature faster than others. And then that will allow you to get it scheduled in and planted and harvested. And where I'm located in North Platte, I have a shorter growing season than Omaha and Lincoln. And if you look out in the Panhandle, especially up in Sioux County in the very northwest part of the state, you know, their growing season is shortened up quite a bit more than mine when you think about it, you know, losing weeks of time. So always finding that maturity is really important. So when we look at a seed packet, for instance, and I'm not promoting one brand or another, look at the date. Look at the date. When is it ready? And in this case, in the cucumber, it's 55 days. So we need to take this into consideration. And we also have a online calendar here for you, and this link, the time and date, that is really nice to help you count backwards. Okay, so next slide. This is Nebraska data from CropWatch, and this is from some of our climatologists with the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. And so this gives us that median frost date. And I am in the middle of Lincoln County in west central Nebraska, and there is a blue dot right on North Platte. So one county to the east. Go, yeah, over, and there's a blue dot in the middle. That's North Platte. So I'm going to use that blue dot, that October 6th through October 16th, as my median frost date range. And so this will tell you where you need to kind of look. And if you look at the county maps, there are counties that have a couple different colors in them. So someone may say, I just don't have the same amount of time in another part of the county. And you will see in several of these counties, there are 2 or 3 different median times. So there can be differences in the county on the growing season as well. And the average frost date, we look at a body of weather statistics. So it's always important to look at. So we have a couple funny blotches here in Lincoln County, and half of the county's cut in half. So those are all things to consider. This is a great little tool to look at, and you can always look at this link, and the dates are up to 2013. So it's their calculated data over time to 2013, but a good map to look at to give us an idea. Okay, next slide. So this is the basic equation that we work with, and this is in our vegetable gardening neb guide that is also available through us, G1343, and it gives you the fall planting equation as well. But we have the days to maturity. We're going to add 14 days to the harvest period, so you have 2 weeks to harvest. We're going to add 14 days of fall factor because things are cooling down. And then we are going to add, if needed, that 14 days of the frost factor, meaning a crop like green beans that can be damaged at a freeze at 32 degrees. So we count those numbers of days up, we get our total, and we start working backwards on our calendar. And so that's handy. I've also developed a sheet that I'll show you here in a little bit that you can use to help keep yourself organized. This is on our fall vegetable gardening med guide. There's also the garden planting guide from Colorado State Extension. And being out on the western half of the state, we do use CSU material, which sometimes it's covered in a little bit different way for some topics that benefit us in the western half, which are very helpful. And it's a good guide to look at with general information as well. Okay, next slide. So here are some examples. We did a Lincoln example and we did a North Platte example. So we looked at two different crops. In this case, we had someone asking about broccoli. That's great. So here's a chance. Here is your broccoli example right here. Eastern Magic Broccoli, Lincoln, Nebraska, looking at our weather data, 62 days of maturity. Your median frost date is going to be October 21 to 32 because we are working with a cold crop that's going to withstand more cold than green beans will. So you're going to use that median in the middle for October 26th. So we're going to add our 72 days to maturity.
That's a misprint. It should be 62.
62.
I promise the math works out.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, 62, and you add your 14-day harvest period. Your 14-day fall factor equals 90 days. And then you start counting back on October 25th, on your way back on a calendar, for instance, like me, where I'm marking it down, and you get July 27th. Well, in this case, if I'm living in Lincoln, Nebraska, I still have, based on our data, 6 more days to plant that broccoli. So you have some time to do that. Okay, so on my other example, on the other half of the state, we're using a crop that's going to be cold, that can be damaged with the cold. And I like Tenderette green beans. It's an old heirloom variety. It's been around for a number of years. It was developed in Idaho, so it works good out in the western part of the state with our cooler evenings. Our median fall frost date, there's a difference. We have our frost date because that's what we have to look at. It's a frost date, is October 6th through 16th, based on that little blue dot in the middle of Lincoln County, Nebraska. And so we're going to use October 11th as our day that we're going to have to figure in. So we're going to add 56 days to maturity. We're going to add 14 days of harvest period. We're going to add 14 days of fall factor as things cool down naturally. And then we're going to add 14 days of frost tender because this is a crop that once it freezes, it's knocked out for the most part. So when we add all that up, we have 98. We count back starting on October 10th, like I showed you, all the way back, and it tells me I should have planted that July 4th. So my decision to plant this variety of green bean tells me I probably will not get a crop out of it. It's too late. So that's why we use the math in the example to help people calculate that backwards. And this is where the handout comes in. And John did email this to you on your email when you registered, is a worksheet. So for those of you who like to have paper to write things down and organize, it gives you your location, so where you're at, and your median frost date based off of our map, the vegetable crop and the cultivar, the variety, the cultivated variety, or if an heirloom, just a regular variety, and the days to maturity. Then we add together all the dates. We add together the dates to maturity, the days to transplant size if needed. So I put in, 7 to 9 weeks for tomatoes, for example, 7 weeks to grow them indoors and 2 weeks to harden is what we use out here. the average harvest period, the fall factor, and the frost timber. On the back of your map, on the back of your worksheet, has the same map that I showed you on the slide set. So you can go and look here in Nebraska where you're at on that map and see where you're at. So we have Elaine Pyle on here, who's a master gardener from Scottsbluff County. Elaine, you have 3 distinct places where there are temperature differences and range differences just in Scottsbluff County alone. So depending on where she lives in Scottsbluff County, helps her decide that date, that median date. And then also on the bottom, I put the crop tolerance for freeze and frost. So, and it's all basically spelled out here, like on the slide set. It's very easy to follow. So this helps people write things down, and you can organize, you can have 50 of these sheets for every vegetable you're raising or every variety of green bean, and you raise 10 varieties of them. You can calculate it out that way. Okay,
And I will say, these are fairly like conservative date estimates. So it's like,
yes.
if you're a gambler, like you could go ahead and plant your beans. You just have to be aware that it may frost on them.
Yes, and that's, you know, we try to be on the conservative side, so we don't want to disappoint people saying, you know, the law of averages based off of years of data has shown this is where it falls. But, you know, weather is anything but consistent. Depending on where you're at, it can be very, very crazy. And so we may have a very warm fall that I can plant those green beans now and have a wonderful harvest. Or we could have a bust and have a snowstorm and bury everything. So it's always a gamble. But we are on the conservative side with these estimates. The next one is an online calculator that John shared with me, and it's seedsforgenerations.com. And literally, you can put in your days, and you can put in your frost date that you want to work with, and it'll calculate it for you. So this is just a screenshot of that, but this is one, you don't want to do paper, you can put these factors in, and then you will be able to do it.
And I think we had the question of like, is this like the date we gave for the broccoli, is that like you have to plant a transplant on that date? And it's like, no, that is, if you start from a seed, the date for Lincoln would be on the 27th. If you can find transplants somewhere, you know, that will buy you so much more time. And I would also say that you don't necessarily, like you can do transplants. You could try just starting it directly in the garden if you wanted. And if you do transplants, you don't necessarily have to start them indoors. You could start them in like a protected outdoor area. So that's one of the benefits. That's one of the benefits of fall gardening, is you don't have to have the setup inside to start the, you know, the lights and all that kind of stuff. You can do it outside if you want.
You could build a nice cold frame, which is a wonderful set of steps, parts and stuff, and we have those resources as well. But I've even seen some of the suppliers still at the farm stores and our greenhouses still have transplants, and you can get them on really good discounts. So instead of trying the cucumbers from seed, you could go buy the transplants and get a really good deal.
Well, if you can find them, transplants and seeds this year are about like toilet paper. You can't find them anymore in a lot of places. So one thing that you can do to actually extend that even further is do season extension. These are some techniques that you can use to actually protect your plants from frost and freeze. And so you can extend those dates a few weeks at least, maybe even a month or more, using some of these techniques. And some of them may even help with insect pests. Like the floating row cover that I'll share, you can actually use to keep insects off of plants even in the summer. There are a variety of options that you can use. Probably the easiest one for gardeners is the floating row cover. You can find this at most garden centers. It's a big roll of this white fabric. I sort of tell people it's like a giant roll of dryer sheet material. If you use dryer sheets, that's what it looks like. You can get it in various thicknesses, and it offers different degrees of protection, usually between 2 and 10 degrees. And so the way that works is if you buy one that says it offers 4 degrees of protection, that means that the temperature can be 4 degrees colder than the terminal temperature for the crop before it'll have damage. So if we're talking about one of those crops that's damaged at 28 degrees, and you have the row cover that offers 4 degrees of protection, it's actually protected down to about 24 degrees before it's damaged. Row cover tunnels are a little bit higher in the plastic low tunnel. That's a little higher tech, a little bit more of an investment, but it can offer even more protection because you get the airspace around it that offers another buffer. And then we have some other built options. So cold frames, common for our home gardens. I've seen them built like this, you know, very attractive little cold frame. I've even seen them where you just buy a few straw bales and sort of arrange them in a rectangle and put a window over top. And you can protect stuff that way. Cloches, very common. You know, people go out and cover with like jars and clear plastic jugs and things like that. And then if you're really dedicated, or if you're a farmer, you have a high tunnel, which is basically an unheated greenhouse you plant directly into. We have more and more of those in Nebraska, but that's more of a farmer option, or like you have to be a really dedicated gardener to invest in a high tunnel. Maybe you could use like a small greenhouse or something like that.